Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Elections Weekly, our weekly election and politics news show. I am your host, Eric Cunningham, and with us, as usual, we have Joe Szymanski, who is the head of our elections team and the head of our interviews team as well, and Dylan Wade, who is a contributor to Elections Daily and also a podcaster and has done a lot of other stuff. So we're happy to have them here this week as we had a pretty substantial news cycle. Specifically today, we've had several big things coming out and things that will come out. So we'll go ahead and start with the big news of the day, which is the Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, who was first appointed to the Supreme Court under President Bill Clinton, has announced his retirement from the Supreme Court at the end of the term. What this means is that Joe Biden will have a chance to appoint a Supreme Court justice before the midterms. This is fairly typical of a president. Most presidents, except for, I believe, George W. Bush, and Jimmy Carter, have had first-term appointments. Former President Trump had 3 of them. H.W. Bush had an appointment before, I believe. So this is continuing in the line of that. President Biden has announced that he will be announcing a pick, I believe, at the end of February or by the end of February. And said the nominee will be his choice will be a black woman, which is what he promised on the campaign trail during the election. There are a couple of key candidates who are thought of, neither of which are named Kamala Harris. That's not actually a thing that's going to happen. There are several other qualified people who are on his list, and given what is going on, we don't expect this to be a bipartisan confirmation, but we do expect this confirmation to happen. Democrats do control the Senate, and you can confirm with 50 votes plus the vice president, or even fewer if there's Republicans that join on. So I'll go ahead and throw it to Joe here to kind of give us the rundown on what happened, how this came out over the weekend, or how it came out earlier in the week, and then we'll go into some of the potential candidates for this position.
Yeah, so this was kind of the retirement that if one was going to happen in President Biden's first 2 before the midterms, that it would be this one. Breyer, as Eric mentioned, has been in since the Clinton administration. He's in his 80s now. I believe he is 83 years old. So he is certainly getting up there in years. And obviously with how narrow the Senate is, and as the environment continues to look very poor for Democrats going into 2022, clearly, I think understanding the situation that was going through Justice Breyer's head, he wanted to be replaced by someone who was as the same ideological thought as him. He will now get that wish. And this is going to be significantly less, I think, massive as the last couple of Supreme Court justice nominations. Really, it would be. This is more akin to Kavanaugh replacing Kennedy. If the accusations hadn't come out against Justice Kavanaugh at the time, that probably would have been a relatively similar confirmation to what we're seeing now. A partisan confirmation, but not one that necessarily changes the partisan balance of the court. The Gorsuch confirmation was, of course, seen as controversial because of how Republicans held that seat open until the post-2016 election. And, of course, the Amy Coney Barrett nomination was seen as controversial due to the fact that it changed the balance of the court from a 5-4 conservative majority ideologically to a 6-3 conservative majority ideologically. We won't see any change from this. Breyer is of the liberal wing. He will be replaced by someone of the liberal wing. He will not be replaced by someone who is a conservative, of course, by this presidency and by this Senate. 2 big names to watch. Justice Brown Jackson, who is on one of the circuit courts, has been mentioned as the big one. Obviously, Biden has said he has wanted to nominate a black woman. Miss Brown Jackson is one of kind of the 2 major candidates. She's 51 years old. She's been seen as a potential Supreme Court justice for Democrats for a long time. And at her age of 51, a lot of people seeing the age of Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan kind of see this is kind of Brown Jackson's last chance to really be seen as a as a legitimate Supreme Court nomination, as we've seen these justices get younger and younger when they are nominated. At her age, is kind of seen as her last real shot to be nominated. And then also, though, and I believe, let me make sure I am getting this name right here before I go into it here. But Leandra Kruger is kind of the second big name here that we are, looking at right here. She is currently on the Associate Justice on the California Supreme Court. She is significantly younger than Brown Jackson. She's only 45, which actually, in this case, probably makes her less likely to be the nominee if Biden specifically wants Brown Jackson. And there could be signs that Breyer himself wants Brown Jackson because Brown Jackson clerked for him earlier in her career. So, but Kruger has also been a name mentioned, potentially working in both against her and in her favor is her age. She is 6 years younger. She's 45. She would be someone who would be on the Supreme Court for a relatively well-known long time, and has been shown to be someone who can get crossover support potentially from Republicans. She has a slightly more moderate voting record than Brown Jackson has during her time as a justice, but most people believe that Brown Jackson is a likely favorite. She was confirmed to a circuit court by a 53-44 vote earlier, with a couple of Republicans absent, and Lindsey Graham, Lisa Murkowski, and Susan Collins all voting to confirm her. So, I would say the favorite right now is definitely Brown Jackson. There's no doubt about that, but Kruger is one that if they decide they want to go younger, then that would be one that would be probably the nominee that Joe Biden would choose.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I'll go.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, you go first, and then I'll.
I was just basically going to agree with all of that. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So basically, the other thing we're looking at here is how this shifts the liberal wing of the court. So, as has been known, the liberal wing is now down to 3 members following the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her replacement with the more conservative Amy Coney Barrett. Before her death, Ginsburg was one of the 2 more liberal members of the court, along with Sonia Sotomayor, who was by far the most liberal member of the court. The more moderate wing is Elena Kagan, who was expected to be more liberal than she was. Sotomayor was expected to be more moderate than she was, so it kind of balanced out there in the end. And then Stephen Breyer, who is so basically this could go one of 2 ways. Leandra Kruger would probably be more in line with Breyer's philosophy. Breyer is considered to be more moderate because his philosophy is more moderate. He has a judicial philosophy called purposivism, which is kind of a counterweight to textualism. So if textualists focus strictly on the text of the Constitution and the meaning of what that text is, Breyer focuses more on the purpose of the text. He didn't reject the text as written, but he tended to look more into the purpose of what it was, tended to look into legislative history, that sort of stuff, and would result in different outcomes. Could also result in interpretations of the Constitution changing over time in relation to societal norms. An example he would give would be the death penalty, which obviously he considered the death penalty to be unconstitutional as cruel and unusual punishment. That's an example of his purpose, of his philosophy sort of adjusting as the times go on to societal norms. Another thing he focused on was balancing tests. But yeah, he's generally considered to be one of the more moderate members, probably a little bit more liberal than Kagan, but certainly one of the higher up on that wing. So the question would be whether this new Biden appointee will be more progressive like Sotomayor or more moderate like Kagan, someone who's known to go on to Republican appointed justice opinions on occasion, who has good relations with the Republican members of the court, who has a great respect for textualism, even if she doesn't believe in it, and so is able to interface more effectively with Republican justices than someone like Sotomayor, who tends to be often is the only dissenting vote if the 2 other liberal justices, Kagan and Breyer, were to vote with the Republicans. So where are you guys thinking this sort of goes? You think the Biden appointee will shift the court a little bit to the left in terms of the liberal wing, or will this Biden appointee be more close in line with the filling in Breyer's spot and trying to reach opinions a little bit more towards the middle?
I definitely think that it's more likely to go towards the liberal wing, or at least I think that'll be Biden's intention. Whether it actually goes in that direction, as you've said, Kagan was expected to be more liberal, and Sotomayor was expected to be more moderate. So you never really know. But I think Biden's intent is absolutely to shift the court a little bit to the left.
Yeah, I can't really disagree here. But I think to kind of go off of Dylan's point, we really don't know until they're on the court how they will act and how they will judge and how they will create decisions. We won't know until they are on the bench. So obviously with Ketanji Brown Jackson and Leandra Kruger, they have prior records, but we have seen justices with prior records change when they get from a circuit court or a state Supreme Court to the actual United States Supreme Court. We have seen that change happen for these justices, and it could happen for Ketanji Brown Jackson, or it could happen for Leandra Kruger, or it would be exactly what we expect it to be. And I would say, especially if it's Justice Brown Jackson, it will be a move that shifts the liberal ring towards the left. Maybe not in a massive way, but in a slight way compared to what it was when it would be Sotomayor, Breyer, and Kagan.
Mm-hmm. And for those who are watching, I'm going to pull up a graphic here, which kind of gives an idea of where justices are ideologically. So this, I believe, goes up to Amy Coney Barrett's first term. So give me just a second to open it up. But it'll give you an idea of where Breyer is historically speaking on the court, and then where a potential Biden appointee could go in, as well as where the other liberal members of the court are. So this is ideological leanings of Supreme Court justices going back to 1935. 8 is the most conservative. -8 is the most liberal. You'll notice here there's a big outlier, which is William O. Douglas, who was by the end of his tenure got to literally a -8. Probably had to expand the scale out from like a 5 or a 6 to be able to get to that point. William O. Douglas, for those who are not, is one of the more famous liberal justices. One of his dissents specifically questioned whether or not trees have standing. He posited that trees could potentially have standing in a lawsuit. So that's how you get to -8 on the ideological scale. But you'll notice most of the liberal justices have actually leaned more in the -4 range. So about halfway between liberal and conservative. Then the conservatives also lean more up there. So the current justices, you got Thomas is the most conservative, then Alito. Gorsuch and Barrett are fairly similar. Kavanaugh's fairly similar to Roberts. And then right on the liberal wing, right around -1, you got Kagan, you have Breyer, you had Ginsburg, and you have Sotomayor. So basically what we're expecting is that whoever this nominee is will go probably from the Breyer position of being about -1, -2, probably more towards Sotomayor, at least closer to it than what Breyer is. Could even be closer to Ginsburg, who even, Ginsburg wasn't extraordinarily liberal as far as courts go. I mean, in comparison to trees have standing guy, that's a little bit of a challenge to match up to that. So that's kind of what we're looking at in terms of where this thing can go. Obviously, we need to know the nominee first, and we need to kind of hear from their testimony, watch their opinions. But it is generally expected that Brown Jackson or Kruger will be probably among those two chosen. Given Biden has limited it to Black women only, that actually reduces the substantial range of nominees much more than any of the Trump nominees. There were, I believe, any of the Trump nominations had several candidates who could have been chosen with very different judicial philosophies. You have your Kavanaughs, you have your Gorsuches, but you also had people like Tom Hardiman, who was generally considered someone who would be more moderate. So that's just kind of what we're looking at with the Supreme Court. We'll keep you updated, of course, as this process goes out, as a nominee is selected, and as the Senate debates and ultimately, likely in all likelihood, confirms Joe Biden's first Supreme Court nominee. So next up on our list is Georgia. So Georgia is one of the more interesting states we've been followed. We wrote an article, or we had an article from Kraz Grenitz and from myself last year, or sorry, not last year, either last year or the year before that, 2020, 2019, that focused on Georgia quite heavily on its status as a pivotal bellwether state, and specifically as one where Democrats could be trending in the right direction long term. Ultimately, we didn't call Georgia correctly in our presidential or Senate ratings, but we did predict that trend long term. So given that Georgia has now flipped to Democratic at the presidential level, has 2 Democratic senators, it was generally considered that Stacey Abrams, the presumptive Democratic nominee for governor, would have a very easy time, or at least a relatively easy time, running for and winning a gubernatorial race in 2022, even with a potential Republican year. However, polling has put a little bit of a damper on that for Democrats. There have been 2 polls that have come out in the last week, the most recent from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, which showed several major things. The first thing it showed was that Biden is deeply underwater in Georgia. I believe it had him at a 36% approval rating.
34, I think.
Yeah, 34%. And if that seems low, yes, it is. It is very low. Also, keep in mind that Republicans did just flip Virginia, so you can't really dismiss that out of hand. Biden is, as far as presidents go, he's pretty historically unpopular in comparison to everyone but Trump right now. He's really not doing very well, so you can't dismiss that number out of hand.
Oh, no.
Yeah, but this poll showed that, for one, in the Senate race, Herschel Walker, the presumptive Republican nominee, held a very narrow lead over incumbent Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock, which is generally considered somewhat surprising, but it's not out of hand with any of the other polls. Most of them have shown a fairly close race. For governor, it showed that, one, Brian Kemp has a fairly large lead over David Perdue, the former senator who's challenging him for governor in the primary. This is something I have predicted myself, that Kemp would win a primary challenge fairly easily, in part because of his strong support in the Atlanta Republican Party. The Atlanta Republican Party and the Atlanta area will really, really like Brian Kemp. The more conservative wing there is still there, and they still make up a lot of voters in the primary. So counting Brian Kemp as the potential nominee, he's in this Atlanta Journal-Constitution poll, he leads by 6 points over Stacey Abrams, 47-41. This is not what people were expecting to see from a poll. There's another poll earlier this week that also showed Kemp ahead. I believe it showed him by 1 or 2 points ahead of Abrams. So it's the second poll showing a lead over Abrams, who is notable for running in 2018, doing very, very well, much better than Democrats had thought previously could be the case, then questioning the election legitimacy, then becoming a national Democratic figure in election law, voter registration, a bunch of other things, basically a very high-profile Democrat, one that has a very high sway in the Democratic Party at this point and is generally seen as a future of the Georgia Democratic Party. So my question to Dylan and to Joe, what do you take from this poll? How do you see Georgia going at this point in 2022 coming up? And what are some warning signs you're kind of seeing if you look at some of these other states, Virginia being probably the big one, a very similar state with a large urban area, that Republicans were able to flip against most odds?
Yeah, so obviously not a good poll for Georgia Democrats. Not as bad as I think a lot of people are making it out to be.
Mhm.
Biden's approval rating is not good. 34% is really, really bad. Warnock, though, is outrunning Biden's approval rating by about 10 points, 10 to 12 points, depending on which candidate he's up against. That's actually a really good number. I don't expect that Biden's approval rating will remain that low. Trump, at his most unpopular, I think was at about this margin, and rebounded. He got back up to low 40s, I believe. And if Biden gets back into the low 40s and Warnock continues to outrun Biden by that margin, I actually don't think that poll is as bad for Warnock as it is for Abrams. I think that number is really bad for Stacey Abrams. Sorry, go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I was going to basically agree with you here. I think this is a much worse poll for Stacey Abrams than it is for Raphael Warnock. We do see the power of incumbency here, I think. When Abrams is matched up with David Perdue, I believe she gains a point or two.
She polls at, I think, even with Warnock against Walker.
Yeah, it's basically a 1 or 2 point lead for Perdue in that case.
Yeah, and then you see it, of course, for Warnock, where he again is only down by about 2-3 points in this poll. Probably there a bit of an incumbent boost for Raphael Warnock. But I do want to point to one data point from this poll that I do think, this is we should stress is an early poll. We're less than a year out now. I think let's not forget that we are less than a year out from this race, which I think is probably crazy to a lot of us, but we're less than a year out.
But the campaign also hasn't begun yet. So I would still call this a very early poll, even though we're less than a year out.
Certainly still definitely an early poll, but which is my second point. This is still an early poll. Let's make that clear. Numbers will change. Things will change. We're going to see hundreds of millions of dollars thrown into Georgia again, as it was in 2020, as it was basically for 2021 for those runoffs, and we're going to see millions upon millions of dollars going to Georgia again in 2022. But I do want to point to one key little data point that I saw from the AJC poll that I do think should be worrying for Stacey Abrams, and that in this poll, she does about 7 points worse with male voters than Warnock does. That is something I am interested in seeing if that will continue throughout this whole cycle. If that continues, I think it's not impossible that that is a large enough gap with male voters that is something that could lead to a Warnock win and a Kemp win. That is not something that if we see that gap continue stay in that polling throughout the next 8 months, that's not something we can just kind of, push away there. That's a big enough gap, 7 points in male voters, that you would say, that's enough of a difference that it could see to that Brian Kemp win and to that Raphael Warnock win. And I'm going to repeat Dylan's point. This is I'm not even going to say just worse poll. I'm going to say significantly worse poll for Stacey Abrams than it is for Raphael Warnock. I mean, Stacey Abrams is basically, in maybe unfair terms by me, but in honest terms, I think, running basically a shadow campaign for governor since he lost in 2018. It's been expected since that moment that she would run again against Brian Kemp and that she would be the Democrats' nominee for that race. Let's make that very clear. She's basically been running for governor since that moment. So it's very hard for me to say that this is a good poll for Abrams, for someone who has been in the national message, who has been going basically across Georgia for the last 4 years, to be, down 7 points to the incumbent governor in one of the first two polls to start off with, and to be not in the range of error of both polls in what is becoming a growingly partisan and narrow state. That's problematic. I would say that is, that's a problematic poll. We're seeing we're seeing some things in crosstabs that if I was someone who worked on the Abrams campaign, I would look at, and I would look and compare the crosstabs to our race for the Warnock campaign, and I would probably be, honestly a little bit concerned. What those crosstabs are saying and what we're looking at here, while understanding that we have 10 months, 9 months to go until the November election, but also understanding as potentially a runoff. We'll see. Of course, Georgia still has that law in the books, but it is something that is potentially challenging to the Abrams campaign. Is that it's not the red blaring lights everywhere at this point. It should never be at this early in the campaign, but something to say, hey, I look at this poll, I look at the numbers, I look at the crosstabs, and I kind of look at it and say, hey, very early, but are there some things that we should look at here and say we should probably be slightly concerned with some of these early numbers?
But by that same, on that same point, if I'm the Warnock campaign, I look at this poll and I'm mildly concerned, but I look at the crosstabs and I think, okay, if the national environment improves at all, we should be fine, steady as it goes for the moment. At this point, I think Warnock's problem isn't his campaign or him, it's the national environment. When your president's down, nearly 30 points underwater, there's not much you can do to outrun that. Outrunning it by 10 is honestly a spectacular result for him. I would, if I were on his campaign, I'd just say steady as it goes, pour all your money in, but you're in as good of a shape as I think you probably could be.
Yeah, very good points. And I do have one more question to kind of lead off from this, is that there was an additional poll from Quinnipiac, which showed similar results to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution poll. But there was one polling element that I found interesting, and I know several other people found interesting. As we all know, after the 2020 presidential election, former President Trump paraded around the state of Georgia with ridiculous claims of voting fraud and illegal voting. And these claims are generally considered to be a key reason as to why Republicans lost the Senate race. Republican turnout, specifically in rural Georgia, was substantially down, which could possibly have been tied to voters thinking the election was illegitimate. This Quinnipiac poll shows something different, the exact opposite thing this time. According to the poll, 70% of Republicans say they are confident that all eligible citizens in Georgia will have a fair opportunity to vote in the 2022 elections. The same poll says only 13% of Democrats are confident. That's the exact opposite problem of what Republicans were facing going into the 2021 runoffs, except this time now it's Democrats who are apparently convinced that the election could be illegitimate. This is likely due to not only Stacey Abrams' claims of illegitimate elections, but also due to Republicans passing the controversial voting law last year, which has had a lot of claims made about it, many of them legitimate, but many of them not legitimate, all of which, though, have provided an atmosphere where a lot of people are convinced their vote will not count. I think Dylan wants to kind of weigh in on this here.
Yeah, so I actually don't think that question that Quinnipiac asked accurately gauges the issue, because the Republican voters weren't concerned that their votes wouldn't count. It's that votes that shouldn't have counted would count. So I'm sure they do think all eligible voters will get a chance, but that's not really what their gripe was. That's not what Trump was parading around. He was parading around false votes, not the idea that Republican voters weren't able to vote. Democratic voters have long had, in many states, concerns that eligible voters wouldn't be allowed to vote due to restrictive voting laws. Something that I do think is a fair concern in many regards, but that question also doesn't ask if they think the election will be legitimate or not. I think that number would be different. Concerns over the process and concerns over the legitimacy, I think, I would hope at least, are two very different topics that discerning voters can separate.
Yeah, and I think we had polls like this showing of Republican voters before the 2021 election, and I could be recalling this wrong, but I think it was exactly what you were saying, which is that Republican voters were not only not confident in security, but they weren't confident their vote would count and that the election would be legitimate. That is a different question. Hopefully it's one that other pollsters will ask, because I think it is an important question to ask. I have been long of the frame of mind personally, and I know others are, that it's very unfortunate what has happened in the last several election cycles where people have been claiming that elections have been illegitimate. If this sort of thing becomes a long-term problem and voters become convinced that their vote will not count, that's not a very good thing. It's an even worse thing if they're convinced that the vote won't count as long as the other side is in charge. That's the more pressing concern. So I'm hoping these other pollsters will ask that question and try and gauge it here. I think the most specific one was that Black voters in particular were very unconfident that all citizens would have an opportunity to vote in this poll.
And
which
they
tracked.
and they have historical reason to believe that. So I think that's a legitimate fear among Black voters. I agree with you. I want to see a question asked about whether voters feel the election will be secure, because I think I think that's a much more relevant question to whether voters think the election will be legitimate or not.
And specifically whether it will be more or less secure as a result of the new law. That would probably be a really, really good question. If any pollsters are listening and they're going to frame their polls based on what some people on the podcast say, that'd be a really good question to put in there.
Yes.
Yeah, but I think we've kind of gone over Georgia. But real quick, we'll go over another important state news, which did happen before we get into New York, which will probably take up most of the rest of our show. Alabama, their congressional map was struck down by a federal court, a 3-judge panel that ruled that you would probably need a second Black opportunity district in the state. I think most of us at Elections Daily on the legal side are unconvinced that this ruling will stick. I don't want to speak for everyone else here, but there are we wrote an article about the Voting Rights Act and how it applies federally. Adam Trencher and Kraz Granitz wrote an article there. And one of the key things is that for a district to be a VRA protected district, minority voters must comprise 50% plus one of the voters in the district. Strictly speaking, minority coalition districts are not a thing. So it will be interesting to see how this goes forward because, strictly speaking, this doesn't entirely line up with Supreme Court precedent. But at the same time, it would be pretty unusual for the Supreme Court to strike down a ruling like this. They don't tend to do this too often. So we're going to follow the litigation as it advances. There's a very good likelihood this ruling may be stayed. This could be in court for some time. Obviously, the Supreme Court is pretty busy. They have lots of cases going up. They have a vacancy that will be coming up at the end of the term when Justice Breyer retires and is replaced. So a lot of stuff going on. This may not be taken for a while, which means this could be stayed or it could have a temporary map for the election. We really don't know. But the potential risk of this for Republicans would be losing a district in Alabama, which would benefit Democrats by giving them an additional district. The alternative, of course, is that this goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decides that the Voting Rights Act does not protect minority districts at all, and the Republicans draw a 7-0 map. That's also a potential possibility here as well that has been potentially feared, for example, in the Arizona Voting Rights Act lawsuit. There are concerns that the entire Voting Rights Act could be gutted as opposed to just the portion that the Supreme Court ruled on. So we'll be following this litigation. People more knowledgeable about the law than any of us here will be looking at this and giving you updates as it advances. But yeah, keep an eye on Elections Daily and Adam Trencher and Kraz Granitz when if they do write about it. We'll keep you updated on that. So I believe our last topic of the night will be the New York redistricting. New York is the last big Democratic state to be putting in their maps. Earlier in the year, their independent commission, earlier last year, I should say, their redistricting commission failed to reach an agreement on a congressional map. Republicans and Democrats had conflicting proposals, and as a result, redistricting has been kicked back to the legislature. I'm going to go ahead and throw it to Joe here to explain kind of the process a little bit, and also clear up some of the misconceptions about the New York redistricting process that some people have, and particularly the role of the governor in this whole process. I'll go ahead and throw it to Joe to kind of explain some of this.
Yeah, well, we've kind of reached the borderline point here of the New York state redistricting process. As Eric said, the appointed commission has officially kicked the process to the legislature, and we've heard that we expect maps to come this weekend, probably, which that could lead to anything from tomorrow night to Sunday evening. And it's not out of the possibility if it's a potentially map that would either upset Democratic activists or it upset Republican activists, depending on its severity, that these folks release it on Sunday night when a massive football game is being played. As of course, Sunday is the day that both the AFC and NFC championship games will be played in the National Football League. So if a map is potential to be criticized by either side, whether it is very aggressive or in some cases for some Democrats not aggressive enough, that would probably mean we'd expect the map to be announced on Sunday night to try and force it under the news cycle. But otherwise right now, and as Eric wanted me to mention out the role of Governor Kathy Hoechel, the role is not as maybe effective as some governors. To my knowledge, Hoechel cannot propose her own map. She cannot act on any suggestions. She is basically there to sign or veto the map. She cannot, draw her own map or create any districts. So the idea of a Hoechel-mander is not necessarily true, but the idea of a Democratic state legislature gerrymander is certainly true. That is certainly the case. Really, what I've been hearing about, and some of the worries that I've heard, is that Democrats will not go hard enough on the Long Island portion of New York State. That they might try and go for a Nevada type thing where they try and make a scenario where they win all four, potentially in a wave scenario, all 4 seats. But as was seen by the Suffolk and Nassau County local election in 2021, there were some pretty significant swings towards Republicans in those elections. And some mapping Democrats, some data Democrats I've talked to are concerned that if they don't go hard enough there, that could potentially lead to a not a full map-wide dummy-mander, but a potential Long Island dummy-mander, in which instead of only getting, Republicans end up with 3 seats potentially in that part of New York instead of only 1 or 0. And then upstate, there is some concern that they do not necessarily draw upstate or the Hudson Valley correctly. And there are some concerns that maybe Biden 2020 numbers are not maybe the most accurate here. Upstate, obviously, it is not very hard to draw a bunch of Democratic districts upstates that are more than 10 points to Joe Biden, but it is very hard to do that with numbers from Hillary Clinton. We don't know necessarily how upstate is going to react. It's an area that could be, very Republican, or it could be an area that could be, kind of swingy, purplish 50-50 to a Democrat that it likes. They like Joe Biden, so it voted in a more purplish way than it did in 2016. But there are some concerns that some of those seats could become more competitive if it is an upstate environment that is more upset at Democrats. And that's kind of the main thing here. How much do they want to pack and how much do they want to risk? Some of the swings in these parts, Long Island and upstate, where there haven't really necessarily been trends, but we've necessarily seen swings kind of go one way or another in these areas. And it's going to be very fascinating to see how they draw these maps. A Biden single digits in the upstate that would eliminate a Republican district upstate isn't necessarily a district that would be solid for 2022 at all in any ways. And I would say the same thing for any Long Island districts.
Mm-hmm. And it's worth noting, specifically, I'll throw it to Dylan here in a second, but the several things is that, one, in Long Island, Republicans did take control of both Nassau and Suffolk counties county legislatures in the recent local elections. That has some Democrats spooked. I actually believe Republicans won all of the offices in Suffolk County or Nassau County, which is fairly unprecedented in recent years. And in upstate, if it were a state, upstate New York would be one of the most competitive swing states in the country. This is an area that voted for Donald Trump narrowly and then voted for Joe Biden narrowly. You can draw a pretty effective Democratic gerrymander, but a lot of these counties upstate not only voted for Donald Trump in 2016, they voted for Republicans down ballot. Louise Slaughter almost lost her Rochester-based district in 2014, a fairly uncontroversial Democratic incumbent who even Republicans tended to like in the House. There are other areas. John Katko, his area around Albany, has started shifting a bit more Republican lately. He probably wouldn't appreciate it. And then you have, John Katko. What's his name? Paul Tonka. His district has started shifting more Republican in recent years relative to the rest of upstate. Obviously, John Katko won a Democratic district that voted for Joe Biden by double digits. He won this district several times before retiring. So for Democrats, it's more than just draw a bunch of Biden plus 10 seats and call it a day. You actually got to focus on what the incumbents want and on what is electable. We do expect a Democratic gerrymander, but the 23-3 Hoechel-mander is probably not something we're expecting to see, to put it lightly.
Yeah, I mean, I don't expect Democrats to go incredibly aggressive. That's not really, even Illinois wasn't as aggressive as it could have been. Nevada is Nevada. New Jersey, they kind of went with a status quo map where they just short up the districts, short up the incumbents that are there. So I don't expect New York to be crazy. I don't expect 23-3. But who knows? Democrats getting spooked by the Nassau and Suffolk elections is unsurprising, but it was one cycle. It's a bad year for Democrats, and it was a local election. I
Mhm.
don't know how much you should be taking from that. Obviously, something to keep in mind, but if you're going to base your entire redistricting plan around that, that seems dubious.
Mhm. Definitely. There's a lot of factors they're considering here to be sure in drawing this map, and when they do announce the final lines, we'll bring you coverage. We'll go over the map in that week's episode of Elections Weekly, among other things. But we'll be sure to keep you updated on this as it progresses. I was going to say one other thing about New York, but this is definitely the last big Democratic state to keep an eye on. There are Republican states that have yet to have their maps in. I believe Missouri is still debating their congressional map. Kansas is still awaiting a Democratic veto potentially of their
Florida.
congressional map. Yeah, Florida is a work in progress. That's the last big Republican state. So we're not entirely out of the woods here on redistricting. We'll keep you updated as the process progresses and as things continue to advance throughout the redistricting cycle. This only happens once every few years. So, as it happens, we'll keep you updated. We do expect, obviously, Democratic gerrymander, though, in this state, and we'll keep you updated otherwise. Have anything else before we throw it off for the night?
No, I'm good.
All right. Thank you guys for watching and listening. I really appreciate your support. You've really helped us continue to grow. So if you like the show and like what we do, you can like and subscribe on YouTube, and you can also like and subscribe, I believe, on our podcast platforms. If you're listening to us on those, we really appreciate your support on those platforms as well. You can find us at elections-daily.com. We have election news coming out regularly, political news coverage, not just American politics, but international politics. We have a great UK election contributor corps who really know their stuff. And we're going to be getting you some updates on the UK if they have some of the some interesting stuff coming up lately. As if you follow politics across the pond, they have been. Boris Johnson is making Joe Biden kind of look like Ronald Reagan in terms of popularity, or FDR. So we'll have some stuff for you there with that as well. Yeah. And you can follow us obviously on social media at elections_daily. You can follow me on Twitter at DE Cunningham too. Where can we follow you guys on Twitter, Joe and Dylan?
You can follow me at Joseph Szymanski. You see it right there, my little name. At JOSEPHSZYMANSKI. You'll mostly find me putting out rapid political analysis on there, but you'll also see me sometimes tweet about George Mason basketball, Washington Capitals hockey, and Pittsburgh Steelers football. To get just a nice, well-balanced amount of culture in there for y'all. If you follow.
You can find me at Dylan B. Wade 1, DYLAN B. WADE, and then the number 1. Mostly politics, but I try to mix in some movie takes in there because politics is depressing. And
yeah. And I actually used to be on Dylan's podcast, Popcorn Politics. We talk about movies and we talk about about politics. So it's really fun.
Yes.
Be sure to follow both of these guys. They're really, really smart. They know their stuff. But yeah, thank you guys for watching and listening. We'll see you here next week, same time, same place for Elections Weekly. Thank you.